Hello all. This week we will discuss about memory. This chapter should be quite interesting as it will be relevant to all of you taking classes, which may require you to learn and memorize the course content and to better access to our memory, especially when taking exams or quizzes. So, this will be the part 1 of chapter 6, memory. So in today's lecture, I will first introduce you to the three processes of memories, which are sensory memory, short-term memory, and a long-term memory, and we will discuss each one in depth. So, how do you usually memorize things? And I know that there are a lot of different ways that you might use. So some of you may say it out loud or write down multiple times until you memorize it. Or some of you may prefer to teach others as a way to deepen knowledge and to memorize the content. But I think it is safe to say that to keep in our memory for a longer period of time, we need to focus and repeat the content before we forget them. So a memory is the retention of information over time. We need to retain the information over time as opposed to forgetting them immediately. And when we need the information, we can access our memory. So there are several important steps, and according to this information processing model, we can break down to three components, which are encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is basically when we input the information, and storage is where we store the information over time. And the last component is retrieval, basically accessing the information we kept in the storage when we need it. So do these processes, the three processes sound familiar? Encoding, storage, and retrieval. So this is pretty much how the computer works. But I'm not an expert in computer, so let me know if you want to ask something. So from a perspective of a computer, encoding is usually done from input devices such as keyboard or scanners or downloading files. The amount of information that a computer receives from these devices are quite large, but these information will be gone quickly if we don't save them. The second stage of memory, which is the short-term memory, can be thought of a CPU, where the information will be temporarily saved in the computer. And the last stage is the long-term memory, where the data are saved in the hard drive, which can be accessed even after 1 year as long as the hard drive doesn't break. And although I guess there is a way to retrieve files even when the hard drive breaks, although I kind of remember paying myself several $100s to doing that. I was in graduate school and the hard drive broke and I wasn't able to access any of the file. But paying some money was well worth it for my several months of sweat and tears. Bitter memories of graduate school. But anyhow, these three processes are quite similar to the computer, which is why the IP model is also said to be similar to a computer model. But I believe we all experience when we are saving all the files, just as pictures, like pictures, videos, and softwares, there will be just too much information. So as we talk today, and also in part 2, it is actually a good thing that we do not remember everything we hear and see. That's just too much information. So using these three stage theory of memory, we will go over each one, and we begin with sensory memory, the first one. So sensory memory is the very first stage of our memory, and And depending on how we input the information, there are actually two different names. So any input we receive from our ears are called echoic memory, and information we obtain from our eyes are called iconic memory. And because these are categorized under sensory memory, both echoic and iconic memory disappears quite quickly. But there are some differences between the two in terms of capacity and duration. So, in terms of capacity, iconic memory is larger than echoic memory. Because iconic memory is basically everything we could see, the capacity is larger than an echoic memory, which keeps auditory information but is limited to what a person can actually hear at one moment. For example, if you are like me, where multiple people begin to talk to me at once, then I can only understand one person, if at all. Which means that the only person I was able to listen to will actually go to my echoic memory, and unfortunately, whatever the other people said will not go into my echoic memory and will be gone immediately. And in terms of the duration, this time, echoic memory is able to hold information longer than the iconic memory. Echoic memory can hold information for several seconds, whereas iconic memory can only keep information for about 1/4 of a second, so basically less than a second. So let's do an experiment testing your iconic memory. In the next slide, I will show you 9 letters in a 3x3 grid for 1 second, and see how many letters you can remember. So again, there will be 9 letters in a 3x3 grid. So here it goes. That was quite fast. How many letters were you able to remember? Based on my experience doing this in classes previously, if you are able to remember 5 or more, then you're pretty good. But although this was a very simple experiment testing people's iconic memory, there's one huge flaw to this experiment. Can anyone guess what the issue with this experiment was? So one issue with this method is that considering that our iconic memory only lasts 1/4 of a second, as you're saying the letters you saw or even listening to my question of how many letters you remembered, you probably have forgotten a lot of the letters that were originally in your iconic memory. But a research would say that all 9 letters did exist in your iconic memory. But how do we know? So George Sperling conducted a very creative study in the 1960s, where he used a sound to indicate which rows of letters you need to say out loud. So if you heard a high tone, you would need to say the letters on the top row. Medium tone will indicate to recall the middle row, and the low tone will indicate to recall the bottom row. That way, you don't need to say all the letters in the grid, which again would cause you to forget as you are saying the letters out loud. This study did in fact show that participants were able to recall most of the letters. And I will attach a link where you could try it yourself and see how you do. And know that the first minute of the video is a practice session to get used to the high, medium, and low tone of the sound. So it is a quite interesting study, so I really recommend that you try it out. So during the sensory memory, when we pay attention to certain information, it will move on to what is known as short-term memory, or STM. And there are several ways we can pay attention, but one common way is called selective attention, where we focus on only one stimulus from among all the other sensory inputs. So for example, some people may like to read a book at the park where there may be other distractions, such as other people talking, or dog barking, or there might be children playing around. But how could we still focus on the books? We only focus on the information from the book while ignoring other information. So we are only focusing on one single information and ignoring others. And that is called selective attention. So by paying attention to one stimuli, the information in our sensory memory would lead to STM. So when information are stored in the short-term memory, or again STM, it is retained for as long as 30 seconds unless some strategies are used. Therefore, this is also not a permanent storage of our memory, and rather it is a limited capacity memory system. So, one way to test our STM can be done by what is called a digit span test. And this is a memory chapter, so there are a lot of experiments we could conduct on ourselves. But digit span test is where a series of numbers are read to the subject, who are then asked to recall and repeat back the numbers. So again, let's try it out. I will be reading out numbers, and after I'm done reading, then you will be repeating the numbers back to me. Or in this case, you can write down the numbers for now. But make sure to wait until I am finished reading the numbers. So here it goes. 9, 2, 5, 4, 6, 3, 8. Were you able to write down all the numbers? To double check if you got it right, the numbers I just said were 9, 2, 5, 4, 6, 3, 8. So this was 7 digits. And the reason why I did it with 7 digits is because that is known as the average number of information we can keep in our STM, or short-term memory. So again, the capacity of STM is about 7 plus minus 2, so ranging from 5 to 9. But because 7 is the average, it is also said to be the magical number 7. However, there are people who could remember more than 7 digits. So what kind of techniques might they be using? Again, if we don't use any strategies to retain the information, they will be lost in about 30 seconds. So if you are really good at memorizing these numbers, you probably are using one of these two strategies: chunking or rehearsal. So chunking is where information are combined into meaningful units or chunks. For example, when I read the 7 digits 9, 2, 5, 4, 6, 3, 8, and if you were born on September 25th, or if you know somebody who were born in September 25th, then that 3-digit will become just one piece of information as opposed to 3 different information. And same with the last 4-digit, which were 4, 6, 3, 8. If that just happened to be the last 4-digit of your phone number or somebody else's phone number that you know, then that also becomes just one piece of information, as opposed to 4 different information. So using chunking, we can memorize much larger information than 7 digits. And another technique is called rehearsal, which is saying the information over and over again. Again, because the information in our STM will be gone in 30 seconds if we don't use any strategies, as long as we are rehearsing the numbers, those numbers will remain in our memory. However, know that the STM is quite susceptible to interference. For example, if a rehearsal is interrupted, then one would have to start over. And you might have experienced this when you were trying to memorize something and someone keeps talking to you. This also indicates that listening to music, for example, while you're studying, especially when you're trying to memorize something, this may not be a good idea. Because again, to be stored in STM, it is susceptible to interference. So music could be interfering you trying to memorize something. And moving on to the last stage of memory, long-term memory. Long-term memory, or LTM, is a relatively permanent type of memory that stores huge amounts of information over a long time. And LTM can be broken down to explicit and implicit memory. And the two subcategories of explicit memory, which are the episodic and semantic memory, and we will go over each one. So explicit memory contains information that is conscious and known, like facts we may learn at school or events that happen in our daily lives. In this graph, it demonstrates how likely we are to retain information we learn in college even after 10, 20, 50 years. So among individuals who took Spanish courses during college, they do forget roughly about half of the content or vocabulary they gain from class within the first 3 years. So there is that huge drop in our knowledge within the 3 years. But after that, if you look at the purple line, it becomes pretty stable. So you're less likely to forget after 3 years. And of course, in general, people who get A's in a course are more likely to retain information compared to those who did not. The grading does matter in terms of how much information that you can retain. This means that you may remember some of the concepts you learned even from this class after 20 years. And if you want to confirm this, let me know 10, 20 years later, and I will be happy to give you an exam and see how well you do 10, 20 years later, or even 50 years later, if I'm still alive. So, the example we just discussed is actually stored in the semantic memory. Again, there are two subcategories, and the example we just talked about, retaining the knowledge we gain in college or education, it could be categorized in semantic memory. Episodic memory, on the other hand, consists of personal information, like daily activities and events. So if I ask you to describe your experience on the first day of college, you're accessing the episodic memory because that is your personal information, which you probably cannot find from reading a textbook or from a class. That is your own personal information. So a lot of times if you start a sentence with I remember, then that indicates that is an episodic memory, whereas if you start with a sentence, oh, I know such and such, then that is probably from a semantic memory. Last, the implicit memory is a type of LTM where behavior is affected by experience without a conscious recollection. So to give you an example, say you're pretty good at playing some kind of sports. It could be any sports, like tennis. And your niece asks you how to hit ground strokes or hit serves. Explaining these behaviors may be quite difficult, as you just know how to swing your racket. And sometimes these skills require subtle muscle movement, which could be very difficult to explain to others, but you just know how to do it without really thinking about it. And basically this applies to any skills, procedures, habits, and even conditioned responses, like the one we went over in classical conditioning. We just behave the way we do without really thinking about it. And now I'm trying to teach my sons how to ride a bike, but it's just really difficult to explain how to ride a bike. It's more about getting used to it and memorizing themselves, as opposed to me teaching how to really ride a bike. I mean, there are some basic information that I need to give to my son, but to be able to really ride a bike, he has to learn it on his own. So hopefully you understand the role of sensory short-term and long-term memory. And in part 2 of the video, we will focus on retrieving information from our memory and about forgetting. And as always, if you have any questions from this chapter, post it on the Q&A in Canvas. Thanks and take care.